Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. Billy has gone to sleep a senile widower and awakened on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. He has gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all events in between, he says. Billy is spastic in time, has no control over where he's going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He is in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he's going to have to act in next. Hello and welcome. Slaughterhouse Five is considered to be one of the best anti-war novels from the preceding century. It's also considered a good example of postmodern metafiction told by an unreliable narrator, which is a mouthful to say and a fair amount to explain. In very brief terms, the narrator, who is the author, self-inserts from time to comment on events, and he's aware he's telling a story around real experiences and real people. At the same time, the narrator is aware he's fictionalized certain aspects for the sake of the theme and the narrative. So there's a fair amount of self-awareness in the story. Additionally, the protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, is also an unreliable narrator. He claims to be traveling backwards and forwards in time, experiencing his life somewhat randomly. But this is a questionable claim. One could make a strong case that Billy isn't actually tripping through his life's timeline. He may simply be delusional. What he experiences is a result of him dealing with trauma, and these random trips through time are his coping mechanism. Or he could be exactly what he proclaims, a man who is unstuck in time, with an awareness that includes knowledge of his entire existence from beginning to end. There's enough ambiguity that it can be interpreted either way. So, both the omniscient, self-inserting narrator, who is also the author, and the protagonist have an unreliable voice in the narrative. This storytelling device is amazingly complex, yet somehow wonderfully simplistic in its execution. Notoriously, it took Kurt Vonnegut over 20 years to write a novel discussing his experiences during World War II. In fact, he was a witness and survivor of the pivotal event that is the centerpiece of Slaughterhouse Five, the complete annihilation of Dresden in 1945. So, to a degree, it's a filtered humanist view of an event that never should have happened. But it did. So it goes. Billy Pilgrim is an interesting case study in post-traumatic stress disorder. In more modern movies or media, PTSD is usually depicted as self-destructive behavior. In comic books, the work of Tom King, Mr. Miracle in particular, illustrates this approach. The person suffering is emotionally detached, seemingly incapable of processing the traumatic event. Their continued survival is perfunctory. They appear to have no interest in engaging with those around them, and most notably, they avoid admitting a problem exists. With Billy, he begins as an observer. In fact, he may be barely conscious, only operating on a very basic level. He is disengaged. He is unstuck in reality. He observes, looking for a purpose or a reason for his continued survival. In the words of Kurt Vonnegut, when speaking about the real person who was the basis for Billy Pilgrim, he said, "He did not understand the battle. He did not understand being a prisoner. He did not understand the destruction of Dresden, because there was nothing to understand." This is Billy Pilgrim, someone who's trying to make sense of something utterly senseless. He's looking for reason in an unreasonable situation. He is traumatized by very real and very existential chaos. After the war, Billy becomes an optometrist. To continue the sight metaphor, he helps others to see clearly, much like the author and narrator who is helping others to see the horrors of war. To enhance the metatextual element of the novel, there are three other noteworthy characters that appear. Elliot Rosewater, the protagonist of the novel, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. The alien species, the Tralfalmadorians, who appear in Sirens of Titan. And Kilgore Trout, the writer who would star in the forthcoming novel, Breakfast of Champions, but who also appeared in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. Rosewater and Trout have somewhat minor but pivotal roles, although Trout could be seen as yet another proxy for Vonnegut in the story, After all, like Vonnegut, Trout is a somewhat grim science fiction writer. But Kilgore Trout was inspired by the writer Theodore Sturgeon, a friend of Vonnegut's. Regardless, discussing Kilgore Trout is a rabbit hole, so it's best just to acknowledge his presence and move forward. Of the three, the Tralfamadorians are the most significant. These aliens abduct Billy, place him in a zoo with a porn star, Montana Wildhack, and then watch these two live their lives. During this period, Billy learns about the aliens' fatalistic point of view. They are fourth-dimensional beings that are able to experience all the moments of their life simultaneously. So, to them, they are always living and always dying, and death is just another event in their spectrum of experience. Thus, when one of them dies, the Tralfamadorians simply say, "So it goes." No fear, no sadness, just an objective statement of fact. Overall, this has been a long prelude to discussing the graphic novel adaptation of Slaughterhouse Five. These are some of the elements an adaptation has to get right, he says. With the adaptation of one medium to another, one has to make allowances for changes. For example, in the graphic novel, most of Kilgore Trout's stories appear in comic books, rather than being short stories appearing in pornographic magazines. All things considered, it's a minor but good change that lets the story continue to flow in a graphic manner. It somewhat enhances the already present metatextual element. There is one aspect that is nearly impossible to adapt, and that would be the distinct voice of the author, Kurt Vonnegut. Although the scripter does their best not to get in the way of the original text or to trim too much from the source material. In other words, the script is a reasonably good imitation of Vonnegut. It's not flawless, but it is a good, respectful effort. There are other interesting creative choices, such as reducing a character to 3 panels. Additionally, there's the insertion of silence, when chunks of dialogue are split into multiple panels to indicate a character's internal rhythm, so to speak. It's a very modern technique, so it feels tailored to a modern comic book audience. Regardless, it flows well and does enhance the moment. There are 2 elements that didn't work. The beginning is rather truncated, but it does contain the most relevant point of the introduction. However, there is a tiny change that alters the context, and that would be the line, "All of this happened to Kurt, more or less." What makes this a problem is it unintentionally sends the wrong message. In the source material, the line is, "All of this happened, more or less." The subtle difference is, Vonnegut doesn't say, "All of this happened to me, more or less." It's not a personalized statement, it's observational. Certainly, the novel contains Vonnegut's experiences during the war, but it's not specifically about him. It's about the experience of war. Not to mention, the characters and scenes are fictionalized to serve the theme, and that's established with the first line. It's a story about truth, not a true story. So it's a rather important distinction, and the change undermines the context of the story that follows. Yes, this is being picky and pretentious, and it's the opinion of someone who is too familiar with the source material and who might be a touch precious about it. So that's some context for the context. Another element is also nitpicky. Nudity was self-censored. It seems like an odd choice for the adult subject matter. It gives the impression the adaptation was trying to avoid limiting its exposure to a particular audience, which is a reasonable concern, since the novel has been banned from some school libraries as recently as 2007. Unfortunately, it also suggests the bias that a graphic novel is intended for a younger audience. So, the nudity was erased because cartoon boobies and penises aren't appropriate for a young mind, he says. But one can't be too critical about this aspect. The choice is understandable, and it's likely a publisher decision rather than a creative one. Even if it was a creative choice, it doesn't damage the source material. The inclusion of Billy Pilgrim's timeline at the beginning is also a reasonable choice, considering the story is fractured. It's not something that's entirely necessary, because the narrative thread is rather tight and concise, but it works to introduce the major events that follow. Not to mention, it subtly enhances the self-awareness found in the original text. To this point, most transitions between time periods are well done. When possible, the transition is visually represented with a technique Alan Moore and Brian Boland used to great effect in The Killing Joke. There's a static shot of a character, which is then repeated with the character unchanged, but the scene or background has completely altered. This could have easily been done poorly, but when the technique is used, it's rather smooth and organic. When there can't be an organic transition, a panel is used to indicate a time jump. Again, all things considered, these are good visual solutions. In the end, any adaptation faces a series of challenges. Translating one medium to another, even ones that appear similar, is a difficult task. There are subtleties and nuances that get left behind because the adaptation doesn't have the capacity to display them, or these elements are clumsily inserted, which highlights the fact that this is an adaptation. Naturally, the person adapting the material not only has to interpret the source, but they also add their own voice to it, whether that happens consciously or not. In the case of a graphic novel, there are two voices that are added, the scripter and the artist. So there is the potential for the final product being a creative mess. This is not the case with Slaughterhouse Five. Certainly it does have some minor flaws. However, it's an adaptation that respects the source material without being overly burdened by ensuring it's a perfect copy. Any liberties taken are for the benefit of the medium it's being translated into. Finally, it's a story worth telling. More importantly, as the original author discovered, it's a story worth telling right, which is one of the reasons it took 20 years to tell it. In this respect, the graphic novel of Slaughterhouse Five succeeds.